At 1:23:44 a.m. on April 26, 1986, two explosions destroyed the fourth reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The engineers in the control room felt both of them through the floor, through the walls, through the instrument panels that began displaying readings their training had explicitly taught them were impossible. The RBMK reactor could not explode. This was not assumption or rumor. It was engineering doctrine. Soviet nuclear physicists had designed it, built it, operated it for years. They knew with professional certainty what it could and could not do. What nobody in that room knew, because it had been classified, was that the reactor's own designers had identified a critical flaw 3 years before that night, and had decided not to tell the people operating it. The test was scheduled for the day shift, a safety experiment. The question it was designed to answer was whether the turbines, spinning down from a power failure, could generate enough residual electricity to run the cooling pumps through a 75-second gap before backup generators came online. A safety test. To confirm the plant was safer than they thought. The day shift was briefed and ready. Then the Kiev grid controller called. The city needed power. The test was pushed to the night shift. The night shift had not been briefed. They were handed a 12-page procedure with no context for why. The experiment was passed to them like a task on a checklist, by engineers who were exhausted, on a timeline nobody wanted to extend, supervised by a deputy chief engineer named Anatoly Dyatlov, who had a documented reputation for pressuring operators past their comfort. Shift foreman Alexander Akimov was 33 years old. Senior reactor control engineer Leonid Toptunov was 25. It was his first major independent shift on the reactor controls. In the hours before 1:23 a.m., the reactor was in a condition that should have stopped the test entirely. During a required power reduction, Toptunov had allowed reactor power to drop nearly to zero. This triggered xenon poisoning, a buildup of xenon 135 that suppresses the chain reaction and makes the reactor extremely difficult to control. Standard protocol was clear. Wait 24 hours for the xenon to decay. Dyatlov ordered them not to wait. To compensate, the operators withdrew control rod after control rod from the reactor core, far below the minimum number required by safety regulations. The reactor was now fighting active xenon poisoning with minimal shutdown capability, staffed by a night crew, operating under pressure from a supervisor who believed his experience superseded the instruments. At 1:23:04 a.m., the test began. What happened in the next 36 seconds begins with a design flaw that nobody in that room knew existed. RBMK control rods, the rods designed to absorb neutrons and slow the reaction, had graphite tips. Graphite does not absorb neutrons. Graphite accelerates them. When a control rod was inserted into the RBMK reactor, the graphite tip entered the core first, briefly increasing reactivity before the neutron-absorbing section arrived. In the specific conditions that existed at 1:23:40 a.m., this flaw had consequences nobody could anticipate. Toptunov pressed the AZ5 button, the emergency shutdown, the button that was supposed to insert all control rods simultaneously and end the reaction. The power did not drop. It surged. In approximately 3 seconds, reactor power climbed to an estimated 10 times its maximum rated capacity. The cooling water flashed to steam. The steam pressure destroyed the fuel channels. At 1:23:44 a.m., a steam explosion blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off the top of the building, and ejected burning graphite and reactor fuel across the entire site. 4 seconds later, a second explosion finished what the first had started. The control room personnel described what they felt before they understood what it meant. A shudder, not a sound first, a physical transmission through the structure, through the floor, through the chairs, through the desk surfaces their hands were resting on. Then the sound arrived. Ceiling tiles fell, light fixtures swung, instrument panels lit up in simultaneous alarm, needles pinned at maximum, others simply dead. The air changed. Multiple survivors described it the same way, a metallic presence, not exactly a smell, a taste, the sensation of breathing air that had been ionized by radiation, a faint tingling across exposed skin, a warmth with no identifiable heat source. Neither the taste nor the warmth was understood in that moment for what it was. The dosimeters showed 3.6 Roentgens per hour. The reading was wrong by a factor of thousands. The available dosimeters could not read above 3.6. When a reading exceeds an instrument's range, the needle pins at maximum, which reads, to an observer, as maximum, not as beyond maximum. In some areas of the building, the actual radiation level was between 15,000 and 30,000 Roentgens per hour, a lethal dose absorbed in minutes. The operators were being irradiated at rates their instruments were not designed to measure, in a building whose damage they could feel but not fully observe. And the man in charge had already decided what had happened. Dyatlov's position, maintained through the early morning hours, was that the reactor had not exploded, could not have exploded. Graphite, which could only have come from inside the reactor core, was scattered across the site in chunks. Firefighters, without radiation protection, picked it up with their bare hands and described it as warm. Dyatlov ordered the operators to begin pumping cooling water to the reactor, to restore the cooling circuit, to manage the situation as though the reactor was damaged but intact. It was not intact. Akimov and Toptunov went themselves to open the water valves manually. They worked for hours in direct proximity to heavily contaminated material. By the time they were evacuated, both had absorbed doses that would kill them within weeks. Alexander Akimov died on June 11, 1986, 43 days after that night. Leonid Toptunov died on May 14th. He was 25 years old. Valery Legasov, the physicist who led the Soviet scientific response, recorded his account onto audio cassette tapes before his death by suicide on April 27, 1988, the second anniversary of the explosion. In those recordings, he described Chernobyl not primarily as a technical failure, but as a systemic one. A culture in which the people at the top decided what the people at the controls needed to know, and decided that the control rod flaw, identified years before the explosion, was not something reactor operators required. The operators in that control room were not negligent. They were working from an understanding of the reactor that had been deliberately made incomplete by the people who built it. They felt the explosion through the floor, through the walls, through every instrument they had, and they spent the hours afterward trying to save a machine that had already destroyed them, because nobody had told them it could.